hello everyone. For those of you that I've not met yet, my name is Leonardi. I'm a historian based at Durham University in the UK, and I work primarily on South Sudan and increasingly also on northern Uganda. I'm really grateful to the RCC for generously giving me this fellowship at the very beginning of a new project, which aims to explore the history of change in relations with the bush in this region over a long time period from the 19th century through to the present. Given that this research is largely yet to be done, I thought I would focus today on the significance of the bush for political discourse and governance in South Sudan, so that I'm able to draw on some of my previous research. And that research focused on local level forms of authority, justice and land governance, and their role in long-term processes of state formation from the 19th century through to the present day. As well as archival research, these projects also involved hundreds of oral history interviews, mostly in the decade between 2004 and 2014, as well as more informal conversational and observational methods such as attending the chief's courts. And I'm also drawing a bit on some more recent interviews conducted by a team of researchers for a small project on people's access to energy in the capital city, Juba, where rapid urbanisation in recent years has caused a significant expansion of the charcoal trade, and I'll come on to that later in the presentation. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to present my ideas to the RCC community. I wish you could all be here eating lunch while I'm talking, but it still feels like such a privilege to be here at all and to be engaging with this incredible community of researchers here in Munich and beyond, especially in these current circumstances. What I'm presenting today are really preliminary ideas that I intend to research in much more depth over the next few years. So it's particularly valuable for me at this stage to get your feedback, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. Just to start with some brief context. South Sudan became an independent state in 2011 after decades of conflict between rebel groups and the government of Sudan. This is a region that has been subject to predation and marginalisation by successive state powers, from the violence and enslavement that accompanied the ivory trade and Ottoman Egyptian imperialism in the 19th century, to British colonial rule in the first half of the 20th century, followed by coercive attempts by independent Sudanese governments to impose their versions of national culture and to exploit resources in the south, most importantly in recent decades, oil. And that prompted southern rebellion, two lengthy periods of civil war through the 1960s, and then again from 1983 to 2005. So the rebel movement which now dominates the South Sudanese government, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, has often traced its liberation narrative all the way back to the early 19th century, declaring this kind of fight for freedom against slavery and colonisation by old colonial masters, as well as domination and exploitation by new masters of repressive regimes in Khartoum. In the process, of course, they too became involved in exploiting natural resources in the south and in the decimation of wildlife during conflicts. So there have been increasing voices both within the country and internationally trying to highlight this loss of wildlife over the past few decades and ongoing threats to forests and wildlife, especially as conflict has continued in South Sudan since 2013. So this is a report by the UN Environment Programme, a kind of State of the Environment report in 2018, emphasising that the state of ongoing strife in South Sudan is a major impediment to good governance that would ensure the productive use of its natural resources and the protection of its environmental assets. South Sudan's forests are in danger of disappearing, the future of wildlife in South Sudan, the potential of wildlife-based ecotourism, may be lost forever if the wildlife populations are not immediately secured. And that kind of rhetoric is also the basis for advocating more militaristic methods of conservation and protection. For example, the Enough Project in 2017, calling for military support for conservation efforts. But these kind of crisis narratives also tend to perpetuate particular ways of knowing the environment, and also to treat woodlands and wildlife as not only as resources, as you see in this language, but also as the passive victims of conflict and exploitation. And what really strikes me from the interviews and conversations in South Sudan that I've had previously is that people there understand the bush and all the forms of life and non-life that that term encompasses as far more active, unpredictable, ambiguous agents, shaping history as much or more than being shaped by it. And it's in that spirit that I want to approach the history of the bush briefly in this talk, and then much more deeply through the longer-term project. The bush is ubiquitous in historical and political discourse and in previous interviews that I've done. So people talk about going to the bush as a way of saying that they joined a rebel army. Run into the bush or being scattered in the bush expresses the flight of civilians from military attacks. The government of the bush refers to the SPLM's nascent governance of rebel-held areas. And complaints about jungle law or a government that has come from the bush are ways to criticise the perceived lawlessness and abuses by the military government since 2005. So what is this bush? There are, of course, multiple terms and categories of landscape in South Sudanese languages that I hope to explore more through the project. These are just a few examples from the Kuku language in Central Equatoria, the region where I'm primarily focusing today. And you can see that people are categorising the landscape partly according to the uses that they might put it to. There are over 60 different languages spoken in South Sudan across many ethnic groups, so inevitably the project will need to focus on particular case studies. But from my understanding so far, I think what these words collectively emphasise are places which are not permanently inhabited. And it's common across African languages to distinguish the village from the bush, and there's a long history to this. And I hope this will also be a way to compare with the literature on Euro-American constructions of nature and the wild. Nowadays, foreigners flying over South Sudan often comment on large areas of what they see as empty land or bush. But of course, these areas have very often been used for hunting, fishing, grazing, even farming. The bush is the opposite of empty, even if it's contrasted with the settled villages. It's often synonymous with forest or jungle, but actually here we're very often talking about more open woodland or shrubland, savannas. South Sudan has very varied environments, including floodplains in the centre, more arid areas in the north and east, where cattle herding is the primary livelihood. And then the forests are denser in the south and west, and these have been particularly important refuges for rebels, as well as sources of valuable hardwoods and so on. So I expect that my project will probably focus largely on those areas. And the region that I'm talking about today is in the central southern part of South Sudan. You may be able to see Juba there, the capital. And I've principally done research to the south of that, going towards the borders with Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a view looking across that border towards the hills of Uganda near the Nile. And this is an area where ethnic groups and communities straddle the borders, and there's always been a lot of cross-border movement. This is an example of one of the smaller border points. That stream is actually the international border with Uganda. And people here mostly practice farming as well as keeping some livestock. I could as easily have titled this talk "Not Governing the Bush," because by definition in much political discourse, the bush implies an ungoverned, lawless, amoral space. And yet it's also the site from which a new state has emerged. And in oral histories as well, clearing the bush for the first time is often foundational in the origin stories of particular communities. And yet at the same time, the bush is contrasted with the more human-controlled sphere of the village and settled, governed space. So I want to emphasise the significance of the bush for constituting new political institutions and communities, but in these quite ambiguous or even paradoxical ways. And to suggest that the story of the bush in South Sudan defies and complicates some of the wider narratives about the relationship between state formation and control over territory and natural resources. Conservation more widely, for example, has been understood as part of the ways in which colonial and post-colonial states establish territorial control. But South Sudan is not a place where the state has ever really fully established control over the bush. Governments and state actors have sought to exploit its resources, and at times have intervened very forcefully to try to take control of it. But whereas in other contexts like Southeast Asia, state counterinsurgency against forest-based rebels involved asserting control over these spaces and transforming wild jungles into more controlled state territories. In South Sudan, instead, it's the rebels who have ultimately taken over the state and have some interest in preserving the bush as an ungoverned space, even as they face their own rebellions there now. So this is not a story of the state imposing top-down control over the bush or a straightforward process of territorialisation, but rather of the multiple benefits and vulnerabilities that the bush has afforded to a whole range of peoples and interests. And I want to really highlight that theme of vulnerability, not to downplay the unequal power relations at work in this history, but because I think a sense of vulnerability is common to human experiences of the bush and to the unsettling, ambiguous effects and meanings of those experiences for even the most powerful military and government interests, as well as for ordinary people. So in the remaining time, I'll just try to unpack a little more of what I mean by that, firstly from the perspective of government interests, and then from a more local level perspective. It was the resources of the bush that first drew the interest of traders and imperial powers to southern Sudan in the 19th century, principally in the form of ivory. And revenue from ivory would remain important for the British colonial administration in the 20th century. But hunting or acquiring ivory always made outsiders dependent on the indigenous inhabitants, as guides, trackers, hunters, porters, guards, raiders, servants. And I think the violence and exploitation that characterise those relations can mean that we miss the experience of vulnerability that dependence also involved. And the resulting ways that the geographies of the state emerged in terms of defensive nodes in a way, and the roads and river transport that linked them. The fortified stations that were established in the 19th century by traders and later by government forces were and still are known as zaribas. And that word comes from the Arabic for the thorny bushes that were used already in the region to create cattle enclosures, to protect villages. I just have an example there from flying over northern Uganda, so it's not South Sudan, but you can see the ways in which these thorny bushes are used as enclosures. So that's the basis for this term, zariba, and it reflects the obvious vulnerability of these forces in the 19th century. One of the things that always struck me reading sources later by British colonial officials was how difficult they found the southern Sudanese environment. Not only complaining about heat and flies and disease and so on, but their inability to really comprehend a landscape that was often to them either flat and featureless or so thickly vegetated that they could never get the kind of view that would give them a sense of command over it, and of course made it harder to map and to survey it. So an example here from a railway surveyor in the early 20th century, emphasising how high the grass was already in the wet season, the need to stick to elephant paths, and I think that's an interesting example of the role of elephants in shaping this geography, which I want to pursue further. But this sense in which the bush was unknowable to some extent. They tried to deal with that by climbing hills and mountains at any opportunity to get a view, which for the indigenous inhabitants were sacred and spiritually dangerous places. So that's just one example of how differently the landscape was known to its existing inhabitants. The colonial officers denigrated and dismissed indigenous knowledge, complaining that people lacked any ability to map their own country or to tell them where things were. But lurking beneath that kind of rhetoric was, of course, the awareness that the inhabitants could use this landscape to their own advantage. And so there are also many references in the colonial archives to the bush as a place of escape, hiding, resistance, frustrations with people's capacity to disappear into the bush. And in Equatoria, the colonial campaign against sleeping sickness involved moving people away from streams and thick vegetation where the tsetse fly lived, onto new roads where they could be more easily monitored and controlled. The government also began to create game reserves from which the indigenous inhabitants were evicted or their livelihoods restricted, and that's part of the history that the project will explore. But with very limited personnel and resources, the administration constantly struggled to enforce those measures. and complained about people moving through the bush on hidden pathways, on these elephant paths, or poaching in the reserves. Many restrictions on hunting had been imposed that people also contravened. So in a sense, they were never fully able to control the bush or to control people's movement within it. Tensions mounted in the southern provinces by the 1950s, as British officials were replaced by largely northern Sudanese administrators, who also became concerned with tracking down what they called outlaws and potential rebels said to be hiding in the bush. By the 1960s, southern guerrilla forces were operating in the bush, particularly in the denser forests and hills of the Uganda borderlands. And that established a kind of pattern during the civil wars, which was replicated again after 1983, where the government was increasingly restricted to the garrison towns, while the bush became rebel territory. And we are seeing that again more recently with the conflict since 2013. The interviews that the team did for the Energy on the Move project around Juba found a lot of people talking about the danger of the bush, the ways in which where women in the past would have been able to collect firewood from any kind of forest or bush area around where they lived. Around Juba, they no longer felt safe doing that. And this woman was emphasising nowadays there are no animals with 4 legs that attack people, but it's the animals with 2 legs that attack. It's the humans who decided to be waiting and attacking people in the forest, and that's why there are few women who go to look for fuel, and even men who have no means to protect themselves. And this also explains why it's soldiers who bring most fuels from the bush into the city. And another woman emphasising that, particularly for women, the forest is unpredictable, full of all sorts of uncertainties. And women really emphasised the danger of being attacked if they did go into the bush. But interestingly, when the interviewer asked this last woman if she'd had any bad or good experiences in the bush herself, she smiled and said, "Only a good one. The first boy who told me about boy-girl relationships met me when I was collecting wood in the bush." So that's a nice reminder, in a sense, of these ambiguities, of the way in which the bush has meant many different things to different people. And I want to therefore turn to the more local perspectives on this. And I think vulnerability is also part of how ordinary people have always experienced the bush. A place of dangerous wild animals, as is alluded to here, dangerous spiritual forces also. And indigenous forms of authority and protection have developed in relationship with the bush. So oral histories in central Equatoria trace the origins of landowning communities or clans to pioneering ancestors who first migrated to that area and cleared the bush for settlement and farming. The clan elders, who claim underlying authority over land in customary tenure systems, also claim descent from these firstcomers, and hence a special spiritual relationship with the land, a kind of inherited knowledge of the landscape and its boundaries, even in areas of uninhabited bush. And they often say that boundaries are marked by features like conspicuous trees or hills or streams. So there's an obvious ability to read the landscape, even if it contrasts with the colonial attempts to map it. And there's a sense that access to the bush and relations with the bush need to be quite carefully regulated. Only these kinds of land authorities, for example, could enter sacred forest groves. People whose work involved inhabiting or using the resources of the bush, like specialist hunters, fishers, iron smelters, are said to have often lived outside of the village because there were kind of taboos and stigmas associated with their activities in the bush. And forms of occult power or witchcraft might also be accessed in streams and forests. For example, a particular kind of magical poisoning was said to be acquired by women from snakes in the forest. As well as being risky and unpredictable, the more than human capacities of the bush have been an important source of defence and protection for people, particularly for those who claim a genealogical connection to a particular territory. So there are some wonderful stories in the colonial archives and also in oral histories and songs sometimes about moments when colonial power was confounded by natural and supernatural agencies. The swarm of bees, for example, that forced a colonial punitive expedition to turn back, and which the colonial officer reported was attributed to the powerful chief or rainmaker of the village that they were trying to extract tax from. or the famous rainmaker who caused a heavy rain and a flood to sweep away a newly built bridge in Juba. But there are also many more minor stories that even colonial officials recognised were undermining their dignity, such as falling into elephant traps, getting stuck in the mud, causing a lot of amusement among the local population. And more recent stories about the war against the Sudan government, when government armed forces are said to have been confused and defeated by mysterious fog in the bush or strange lights at night that led them astray, or victories by the SPLA forces, the rebel forces, brought about by the rituals performed by land authorities and rainmakers. And of course, in many more practical ways too, both rebel soldiers and civilians relied heavily on the shelter of the bush, on food and revenue-raising opportunities during conflicts. Yet the rebel army had to emerge from the bush and transform itself into the government of the towns in order to become the state, to take over the state. And it was a very significant moment with a lot of celebration in 2005 after the peace agreement, when the SPLA formally entered Juba, the capital city, the town having remained in government hands until then. And the leadership at that time was promising to take the towns to the people, to bring development to southern Sudan. But instead, since then, the people have come to the towns, marking something of a new chapter in the geography of the country and relations with the bush. Urbanisation and the rapid expansion of trade since 2005 has led to increasing market dependence, while conflict and militarised extraction have made the bush a more dangerous place than ever, even or especially for those profiting from its resources, as our interviews with women in Juba really highlighted. This sense, again, that where women in the past had been able to collect their own firewood, now everything relied on money and their ability to purchase charcoal in the town markets. And also an acknowledgement that this is a risky trade, that the charcoal traders themselves are taking risks by entering the bush and transporting charcoal, and almost an acceptance that adds to the costs of this product. So once again, there's this sense of both the vulnerability and opportunity that the bush offers to those with the capacity to exploit its resources, even if increasingly that means those with guns. As well as charcoal, there is of course ongoing exploitation of other forest resources such as hardwoods and minerals, and often a very unclear regulation of these kinds of resources and involvement of military and state actors in the extraction. So in a sense, the bush has become more than ever a resource frontier, a capitalist frontier since 2005. And that's transforming relations with the bush in ways that I want to explore through the project. But it's also reprising the long history of extraction going back to the 19th century ivory trade. And the bush is still not controlled by the state, though it may be exploited by state agents. The unknown gunmen in the bush that everyone talks about represent the continuing subversiveness and unknowability of this environment for the government. The bush is and has been a frontier in multiple ways throughout history here, not just in relation to the expanding capitalist economy. Go into the bush in the form of military rebellion led to the establishment of a new state. But on a smaller scale, over a much longer time period, people have been transforming the bush into new settlements, farming or grazing land, and often establishing new land claims and new political communities in the process. And that kind of process has been described by Kopitov as a kind of internal frontier in pre-colonial Africa. At other times, the bush takes back over, particularly when people have been displaced by conflicts. So it's been a fluctuating kind of frontier. And as Rasmussen and Lund emphasise, the frontier is a contact zone or a social space, marking the difference between civilization and the wild, but also something that can emerge in multiple places rather than necessarily advancing as a front. But of course, we shouldn't assume that the wild is defined and understood in the same way everywhere. And the new project aims to explore in much more depth than I've been able to here what meanings, categories and uses people in South Sudan have made of the bush in their own terms. This has also been a very human-centred story, reflecting my previous research, but I hope that the new project will enable much more integration of the approaches that I've been learning more about while I'm here, multi-species approaches, animal histories, to think about the bush as a space of encounter with more than human forms of life and death, and to explore their agency and effects. And I want to start that by revisiting the history of the ivory trade from a more elephant-centred perspective, thinking about the ways in which elephants have shaped this geography that I've been talking about today. I need to leave it there, but just to end with some of the research questions that I hope to pursue through the project. And as you can see, these are focused partly on the ways in which the bush has provided resources for people and the efforts to regulate and govern those resources, but really also to try and approach this through what the bush has meant for people, the role of animals, wildlife and forests in people's culture. And so I hope that I intend to pursue methods that will explore things like songs, oral histories, stories and parables and so on, as well as using more traditional archival methods. But I will leave it there and very much look forward to your feedback. Thank you.